Anne Deveson, welcome to Bookshots.
Thank you.
You had a wartime childhood, didn't you? What was that like?
It was chaotic, I think is the only word I can use. I was nine years old and living in a village in England when war was declared, and suddenly we all had to wear gas masks, we had to get ration cards, and for a child of 9 it was just bewildering. And I remember seeing posters saying, "Your country needs you," and I'm thinking, why does my country need me? You know, what can I do? And my father was in Malaya because he was managing rubber estates in Malaya, and he was terrified that we would get hurt, and he kept urging us to go out and join him. And my mother wanted to stay because the voyage over was very dangerous. And then eventually we went. We had an old-fashioned English nanny, a really old-fashioned English nanny who thought she'd come down in the world when she came to us because we were a colonial family. And I remember she joined the Rands when war was declared, and for the first time she had status. She was a petty officer cook, and she came round to my mother and she plunked herself in a chair and said, "Madam, it is your duty to take the children and go." So we went.
Now, you mentioned that your father was serving in Malaya, and you paint a very vivid picture of the fall of Singapore. Tell us a little bit about how he was caught up in all of that and the aftermath of that for him.
Yes, my father, when the Japanese invaded, my father joined the volunteer army, and they were in the jungle fighting, and I couldn't imagine my father fighting because he was a pacifist, you know, but he had a gun. And then he made his way down to Singapore, and there he was in the police rescue squad, and he was helping pull burning people out of buildings. The whole of Singapore was ablaze. The docks were ablaze. Everything was on fire. Meantime, back on the ranch, my mother was with two other mothers, so there were 3 mothers and 6 children, and they all were seeking news of their husbands. And my mother, I remember being told that my father was missing, believed dead, and the 2 other mothers had the same news. And so we were then sent by the Red Cross to a place in Armadale in the bush. It had been a soldier-sailor settlement. And there these 3 mothers and the children, 6 children, were supposed to live off the land. And I suppose for our mothers it must have been terrible because they were in a kind of mourning all the time. But they still used to hope for news, but there was nothing. And then one day we heard this great shriek, and we rushed out, and my brother was in one of the lower paddocks, and we thought the bull had got at him. And then we saw this taxi come up their very bumpy, sandy drive, and there was an elbow sticking out of it. And we all realized it was one of our fathers, and we rushed down, and it was our father, my father. And he had malaria. He was incredibly thin. He was very distressed because he'd had to leave his 2 best friends. He couldn't find them. He tried to find them so that they could come with him, but he couldn't. And they were the husbands of the 2 women that my mother was with. So we were elated, but we had these other 2 families who were deeply sad. And for my father, I think it was really very traumatic.
The book is called Waging Peace. When did you start actually questioning why we go to war?
I think from a very early age as a child. I couldn't understand why German bombs were dropping from the sky. I couldn't understand why when Dunkirk happened, how my uncle, my favourite uncle, went to help in Dunkirk, and not only was another story this, but he was actually gay, and instead of being patted on the back for going back and forth, he was in the Navy, he was court-martialed. So all these were complexities for a child, and I really couldn't understand. And then I had a moment when I was probably a little bit older, when my school teacher, who's called Mrs. Stalin, decided that maybe I had curvature of the spine, and I still hunch my shoulders. Sit up, Anne. And my mother took me to a surgeon, in London, where of course there were sandbags everywhere and air raid shelters. And I saw all these young soldiers, young men marching off to France to war. And I remember being, for about 5 minutes, hugely excited by it and thinking, I want to go to war. You know, I want to fight these battles. I want to win for England. And this enormous sort of patriotism rose in me, and as a child, excitement. And then about couple of seconds, maybe a minute later, I realized that these were young men who were probably going to be killed. And I remember my mother grabbing my hand and taking me away and sitting us down in a cafe, and I suddenly saw that there were tears running down her cheeks because she'd realized the same thing.
But Anne, do you think it's an accident, or how do you think you explain the fact that as a journalist you've been a correspondent who has hurled herself into the midst of some of the greatest scenes of human distress? I'm thinking of you going to Eritrea and Somalia and facing the worst that human nature is capable of in terms of brutality. What do you think that's about?
It's a curiosity that is born of the realization that it's important that we bear witness. It's important that people know what's happening. It's important that we can relay through pictures and through images and through writing what it's like to see starvation when people can hardly walk, their limbs are so thin.
What do you say to the argument that war is actually a part of human nature, that in a sense it's part of our animal nature?
I think that's absolute tosh. I think it's rubbish. I think if you look at all the biological evidence now and you see that you know, that we're supposed to be descended from our gorilla apes, and therefore we can't help it. Can't help raping all those girls, Malaya. Can't help killing all those people. It's our animal instinct. It's not.
Is there such a thing ever, in your opinion, as a just war?
If you look at the war in Europe against Germany, against other countries in Europe, I think I'd say that was a just war. But the way it's fought isn't always just. The way wars are fought isn't always just. And I think it's only just if every other initiative has been taken beforehand, and I'm not sure that it was.
We're told that this, in fact, the 20th century has been the most peaceful century in our history, although it may not have felt like it at the time. What is your optimism founded on? What do you take forward as your optimism in completing this book in terms of your vision of peace?
I think the world in which we live, the amazing beauty of the world, demands that we take better care of the universe and demands that we take better care of each other. And I think gradually, if you look back, we no longer hang little boys from the Tower Bridge. We have stopped capital punishment in most countries of the world. There are all sorts of achievements that have been made, and that's what life is about. You don't suddenly achieve something and then you stand still and give up. You go on achieving, because to work like that and to be like that, it's much more exciting than to just sit down in a puddle and weep.